My name is Melanie, I'm 40 years old. One September morning, as usual, I sat in a small coffee shop on Main Street, where the glass windows looked out onto the quiet road of our Kentucky town. I chose a table near the back, the old wooden one with a long crack like a scar, and sat silently with my black coffee. The steam rose faintly, but it wasn't enough to chase away the coldness inside me. The doorbell rang. I didn't need to look up to know who had just walked in. A chill spread over my skin, like the moment darkness fills a room before you can switch on the light. Ethan, my brother in a crisp police uniform, stepped inside. Behind him were two rookies barely in their 20s, their young faces full of curiosity. Ethan didn't look around. He knew exactly where I'd be, like always. I lifted my hand in a half-hearted wave. He ignored it, striding toward me with the cold stare of someone about to deal with a criminal. No nod. No greeting. The waitress, a young woman named Clara, froze when she saw him heading my way. She leaned down and whispered nervously in my ear. "What's happening, Melanie?" I forced a small smile, trying to stay calm. "Not yet." Ethan stopped at my table. His shoes hit the tile with a heavy thud. From his pocket he pulled out a printed sheet and held it in front of me. It was a blurry black and white still from a security camera. A woman in a hoodie, face mostly hidden, standing near a pharmacy counter. His voice was sharp. "Melanie, stand up." I looked at him, shocked and angry. "Are you serious? That's clearly not me." He didn't flinch, answering like he was reading a report. "We received an anonymous tip. The image matches you." The room seemed to freeze. Customers looked up, whispers spreading. I tried to stay steady, lowering my voice. "Ethan, you know I didn't do anything. Don't turn this into a circus." His eyes didn't hold a flicker of doubt. His words cut through the air. "Silence doesn't prove innocence." My chest tightened. I opened my mouth to protest, but his hand was already gripping my wrist. The cold bite of metal snapped shut on my skin, the sharp click echoing like a gunshot. I swallowed hard, stung by the pain and humiliation. The cafe fell silent. Only the clatter of a fork dropped in the kitchen before everything stopped. At the counter, Clara froze, the order slip slipping from her hand. A child at the front table burst into tears. Every eye locked on me, as if they were watching a play they couldn't believe was real. I didn't resist. I just stared into Ethan's eyes, searching for the brother who once held my hand when I scraped my knees learning to ride a bike. But all I saw was a strange satisfaction on his face, like he had just won a battle I never knew we were fighting. He yanked me to my feet, his voice flat. "Let's go." I tilted my head enough for him to hear me clearly. "You're making a big mistake." The corner of his mouth lifted in a smug grin. "One phone call won't save you." The glass door slammed shut behind us. I stepped out onto the street, under the stunned stares of the whole town. The marks from the cuffs were still red on my wrists, but what truly bound me were the memories. Old images flooded back like a film in reverse, reminding me how quickly family can change. I remembered the day Ethan taught me to ride a bike in a narrow alley in Louisville. I was only 8, trembling on a chipped red bike, my knees scraped from falling again and again. Ethan was 15, laughing loudly but still running behind me, his hands steady on the seat. Each time I wobbled, he shouted, "Don't be scared, Mel. I'll never let anyone hurt you." I believed that promise completely, the way a child can put her whole world in her brother's hands. We used to be inseparable, carving doodles into the wooden kitchen table, hiding in the neighbor's horse stall whenever our parents fought. Mom was the only one who smiled at us then, her gentle voice saying, "You two have to protect each other no matter what happens outside." But then Mom died. I was 26, Ethan was 33. Her death tore a deep crack through a family already fragile. At the funeral, Ethan didn't shed a single tear. He stood stiff by the casket, his face cold. I cried until I couldn't breathe, but when I reached for his hand, he shoved mine away. "Stop pretending, Mel. She suffered enough because of you." The words stabbed straight into my chest. After that, his messages started coming. At first, blame. "You weren't there for Mom as much as I was." Then accusations. "You disappointed her. You only cared about yourself." I tried to explain that I worked to cover her medical bills, that I visited whenever I could. But Ethan wouldn't listen. He built a warped version of me in his head and clung to it like gospel. As time passed, he began to despise the path I chose. I was a high school literature teacher, a job I loved. I cherished afternoons reading poetry with my students, the way they leaned in when I recited Walt Whitman or Emily Dickinson. But in Ethan's eyes, it was nonsense. He sneered. You think teaching a bunch of kids how to write essays is going to change the world? I'm the one actually protecting order out there. I stayed quiet, though it twisted my stomach. I never wanted to compete with him. I only wanted him to remember I was trying to live decently too. Yet every time we met, he hurled cruel words at me as if my very existence was a burden. Once, during a rare family dinner at my uncle's house, Ethan bragged about busting a drug smuggling case. Everyone praised him and I was truly proud too. But then he looked at me, raised his beer and said, half joking, half serious, "And Melanie's greatest achievement? Making Mom cry more than she laughed." The table went silent. I froze, forcing a smile to cover the shame burning inside. But I knew he wasn't joking. In the years that followed, the gap between us became a canyon. I moved away for a while, tried to find peace in Cincinnati, but eventually returned for work. Since then, Ethan barely called, barely asked about me. He only appeared when there was a chance to mock or condemn me. And now, when he coldly snapped cuffs around my wrists in front of the whole town, I finally understood. His promise to always protect me had died with Mom. In his eyes now, I was nothing but a shadow he could use to prove his power. I sat in the back of the patrol car, watching rain streak down the window. Ethan's reflection blurred in the glass, his jaw clenched, his eyes lit with something that no longer belonged to the brother I once knew. I whispered, only for myself, "You once said you'd never let anyone hurt me. Now you're the first one to do it." The car rolled forward, carrying me away from the cafe, away from the remnants of our bond. Inside me, only one cold truth remained. Ethan had turned me into his enemy. The patrol car stopped in front of the police headquarters in downtown Lexington. Rain still drummed on the windows, each drop stretching into a blurry streak. Ethan yanked the door open, dragging me out as if I were some dangerous criminal. My wrists burned, but I clenched my teeth, refusing to let him see me flinch. Inside, the fluorescent lights were harsh, the smell of burnt coffee and musty carpet clinging to the air. Ethan marched me past the front desk, where a few young officers paused, their eyes flickering with curiosity and unease. They recognized me, but no one dared say a word. My brother strode in like he was delivering a trophy, while I was just a silent shadow trailing behind. He shoved me into a cold metal chair in the holding room. A rookie, barely 21, fumbled with the intake sheet, his voice shaky. "Sir, are you sure this is the right person?" The woman in the picture looked taller and she had a limp. Ethan cut him off, his tone like a blade. "I know my sister. Sir, write it down." The young officer dropped his gaze, his hand trembling as he scribbled. I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice steady. "I want to make a call." Ethan scoffed, the sound scraping through his teeth. "Call who? Your little book club? Or some bargain lawyer you found on Facebook?" He leaned down close to my face, whispering so only I could hear. "One call won't save you, Mel. You're nothing." I lifted my head, meeting his eyes, my tone calm. "You'll realize soon just how wrong you are." Turning to the rookie, I said, "Give me the phone." He hesitated, glancing at Ethan. But after a tense silence, he handed it over. The plastic felt warm in my hand. I pressed each number slowly, deliberately, letting Ethan watch. He crossed his arms, lips curling in a mocking smirk. The line connected. When the deep, steady voice I knew so well answered, my chest loosened. "Mel? Where are you?" I kept my tone soft but firm. "I'm at Lexington Police Headquarters." Ethan arrested me. There was a pause on the other end, then a single sentence, sharp as a command. "Don't worry. I'll be there." I hung up, handed the phone back, and offered a faint smile. "Thank you." Ethan burst out laughing, his voice echoing in the cramped room. "That's it? Some pathetic boyfriend? Or maybe you just called your old principal?" "Pathetic, Mel." I tilted my head, speaking slowly, each word deliberate. "You never bothered to know anything about my life after Mom died. That's your biggest mistake." A flicker of confusion crossed his face before he masked it with a dismissive shrug. He turned away, signaling for two other officers to process the paperwork. I sat still, feeling the silence thicken in the air, like the room itself was bracing for a storm. 15 minutes passed. Outside, the rain stopped abruptly, replaced by the rumble of heavy engines. An officer rushed down the hall, his expression pale. Through the narrow window, I caught sight of glaring headlights. Not standard patrol cars. Yellow lights flashing, engines deeper, heavier. Then came the screech of multiple brakes. Car doors slammed in unison like a ritual. My heartbeat quickened, but my face remained calm. I turned slightly toward Ethan. He frowned, then his expression shifted. Panic. Seconds later, the sharp rhythm of footsteps filled the lobby. Men in dark suits, earpieces glinting, moved in perfect formation. Their presence was enough to make every officer in the building shoot to their feet. The main doors swung open. 3 figures led the way. At the center, a middle-aged man in a gray suit walked with quiet authority, his gaze sweeping the room. His voice cut through the silence. "Release her." No. He didn't flash a badge. He didn't need to. His tone alone made the walls tremble. Ethan stammered. Who do you think you are, giving orders in my station?" The man tilted his head slightly, answering with just 4 words. "Governor's office, Kentucky." The room froze. Every officer lowered their eyes as if the ground had shifted beneath them. Ethan's jaw slackened, his gaze darting desperately for backup, but found only wary silence. I stayed seated, rotating my wrists to let the blood flow back. A female agent approached, unclipping the key from Ethan's belt. The metallic snap of the cuffs releasing shattered the tension. I rose slowly, straightening my spine, the bruises throbbing on my skin. The man in gray glanced at me, nodding once, then turned to Ethan. "You just unlawfully detained the governor's wife. And that alone is enough to end your career today." Every eye in the room fell on me. I didn't flinch. I let the truth settle where it belonged. I had been a federal prosecutor for 12 years before stepping away to avoid the spotlight, choosing instead a quieter life with Daniel, now the governor. I had never flaunted it, never mentioned it to Ethan. But now the truth was undeniable. Ethan stumbled back, his voice cracking. "You." I cut in, calm and steady. "I'm still Melanie. The sister you once promised to protect. But you forgot that long ago." Another agent handed Ethan a suspension order, reading it flatly like a verdict. "Effective immediately, Ethan Carter. All authority revoked." The paper shook in his hands. Sweat trickled down his temple. His eyes darted wildly, searching for escape. But no one stood with him now. Even the rookie from earlier turned away, unwilling to share his downfall. I stepped closer, my voice low but sharp. "You always thought shouting made you powerful. But truth doesn't need to scream. It only needs to be seen." His face twitched, lips moving without sound. He staggered back, colliding with a desk, his stare empty. I looked at him, expression steady, whispering, "You called me worthless? Now watch who just buried your career." I turned and walked out, the agent's footsteps echoing behind me. No one spoke, but every step hammered the point home. The power struggle was over and Ethan had lost. When the headquarters doors swung open, the late afternoon light spilled in. The black SUVs still lined the curb, engines warm, waiting to take me away. I drew a deep breath, letting the scent of rain wash away the cold bite of the cuffs. That night, I sat in the living room, the yellow lamp light spilling across the old wooden table, a thick stack of files from the agents laid out before me. Each page felt like a blade, slicing into the last remnants of trust one had left for Ethan. The first report was dated 2012. A woman accused police of excessive force during a stop. The officer's name on the incident report, Ethan Carter. The case was dismissed as insufficient evidence and closed within 3 days. I turned to the next file. A 16-year-old boy claimed he had been coerced into confessing to theft even though he wasn't at the scene. He changed his statement after being held for over 10 hours without a guardian present. Investigator's signature, Ethan Carter. The internal note read bluntly, "Procedure appropriate." I kept reading, my heart pounding heavier. A former colleague had resigned, attaching a complaint against Ethan for intimidation. That complaint was sealed, never brought to light. All of it buried under the same phrase, "Resolved internally." Closing the file, my hands trembled. Ethan's brazen move of handcuffing me in broad daylight wasn't the first time he abused his badge. It was just the tip of an iceberg he had hidden for years. I once thought I was the only target of his grudge, but the truth was far worse. Ethan had turned authority into a weapon to control and threaten anyone who dared embarrass him. The door creaked open. Daniel walked in, resting his hand firmly on my shoulder. You don't have to handle this alone. The governor's office will take it on. I shook my head, meeting his eyes. I can't step aside. This isn't just family business. If I stay silent, more people will be buried like these files. Daniel sighed, then nodded gently. He knew once I decided, nothing could move me. The next morning, I walked into the Kentucky Internal Affairs Commission. The meeting room was wide, with a long table, state flags, and emblems on the wall. A female investigator, Rachel, began. Mrs. Carter, we'd like your cooperation. You were a federal prosecutor. Your experience can help us review the cases that were brushed aside. I gripped the pen in my hand, my voice firm. I'm ready. But on one condition. No file gets buried again. Rachel studied me, eyes sharp, then gave a thin smile. That's exactly why we came to you. The following days drowned me in paperwork. Abandoned lawsuits, mysteriously vanished evidence, witness statements suddenly withdrawn. Each one bore the faint but familiar imprint of Ethan. The deeper I read, the more fury surged inside me. One case made my throat tighten. In 2015, a 19-year-old girl reported being assaulted by an off-duty officer. The accused, Ethan Carter. The case was shelved within 48 hours with the brief note, victim uncooperative. I closed my eyes, picturing her face, wondering if I had ever seen her without realizing it. That night, leaving headquarters, I stood on the steps, the autumn wind cutting sharp. A part of me still wanted to believe there was a mistake. But every page I'd read crushed that fragile hope. Ethan was no longer my brother. He had chosen to become something else entirely, a man who exploited his badge. I pulled out my phone and dialed Rachel. I'll fully cooperate. Give me everything. If needed, I'll testify. There was a pause on the line, then Rachel's steady voice. You're choosing the hardest road. But it's the only one that will bring the truth to light. I ended the call, my chest heavy but resolute. From that moment, I knew I wasn't just Melanie, the sister betrayed by her own blood. I would be the witness, the voice Ethan never wanted to hear. I thought I had grown used to the endless stacks of files on my desk, but when the name Grace Fontaine appeared, my heart stopped. The report dated back to 2015. The victim, 19 years old, stated she was assaulted by an off-duty officer. The conclusion was all too familiar. Victim uncooperative. Case closed. The signature, Ethan Carter. I sat frozen for hours, my eyes locked on that name. A hazy image surfaced. A young woman once walked into my office back when I was a federal prosecutor. Her long hair half covered her face, her hands trembling as she clutched her papers. My superior had whispered then, "Don't touch it, Melanie. This girl could bring the whole department down. Let internal handle it." I stayed silent. And that silence became a weight I carried to this day. That night I couldn't sleep. I traced Grace's last known address in the file. A rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of Lexington, paint peeling off the walls, the wooden doors rotting. I knocked several times, no answer. Just as I turned to leave, a raspy voice came from behind. "You looking for Grace?" I turned. A frail older woman leaned against the doorway across the hall, studying me closely before slowly stepping forward. She handed me a worn envelope. She said if anyone ever came asking to give them this. She disappeared years ago. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a short note. If anyone truly wants the truth, find me where the light doesn't reach. At the bottom was a string of encrypted email addresses. I went home and tried entering the code into my secure laptop. The screen flickered, then a message appeared. "Melanie Carter? I knew you'd come eventually. Meet me tomorrow at 11 a.m., old warehouse on Jefferson Street." The next morning I drove to the address. The warehouse stood deep in an abandoned industrial strip, its rusted steel doors bearing fresh marks of a replaced lock. Inside, weak light filtered through the corroded roof. A woman stood waiting. Her hair was cropped short, her face hardened by years of survival. I recognized her instantly. Grace Fontaine. She looked at me, no smile, no surprise. Arms crossed, her voice raspy but resolute. "So you finally came." I stepped forward slowly, my throat dry. "Grace, I failed to protect you back then." Her lips curled faintly, her eyes cold. "I don't need your apology. I didn't die. I disappeared so I could survive and gather proof." Grace opened a worn canvas bag on the table. USB drives, bank statements, photographs, recordings spilled out. She slid the stacks toward me. This is 6 years' worth of work. Ethan didn't just destroy me. He buried dozens of others. I have names, dates, even the bank accounts he used for bribes. But I can't go public alone. I need someone with access. I drew a sharp breath, placing my hand on the heavy files, feeling their weight like stone. I'll help. I still have access to the state record system. We'll cross-check, connect the dots, prove it's not just words. Grace stared at me for a long moment, then gave a short nod. But remember, Melanie, once we start, there's no turning back. My answer came without hesitation. I stayed silent once. Never again. We spent hours in that dusty warehouse, piecing everything together. Grace explained how she had lived under aliases, moving constantly to avoid surveillance. She had quietly approached other victims, gathered their statements, hid them in encrypted drives. The way she spoke, the control in every detail, revealed how she had turned her pain into a weapon. When I left, I knew nothing would ever be the same. I was no longer alone. I had Grace, the living witness, the one who knew Ethan's darkness better than anyone. On the drive back, autumn wind howled through the cracked window, carrying dust across the fading light. My grip tightened on the wheel, a cold resolve burning inside me. This time Ethan would not escape. That morning, the square in front of Lexington City Hall was packed. Dozens of reporters crowded in, microphones and cameras pointed at the wooden podium set up for the event. A bold press conference banner caught the October sun, blindingly bright. I stood in the waiting room behind the stage, my hand gripping a thick stack of documents, heart racing but my eyes steady. Beside me, Grace wore a gray hooded coat, her face carved with the resilience of years spent in hiding. When the clock struck 10, we stepped out. The noise collapsed into silence. I drew a deep breath, lifted my chin, and spoke into the microphone. My name is Melanie Carter. Today, I am not here only as the governor's wife, but as a citizen, a former federal prosecutor. I am here to speak about truths buried for far too long. The clicking of cameras erupted. I raised the documents, flipping through pages, my voice firm. Ethan Carter, a police officer in this city, did not just unlawfully arrest me. 4 years he abused his authority, intimidated victims, twisted justice to cover his own crimes and those of his allies. I paused, sweeping my gaze across the crowd. Dead silence. Then I continued. This is not one person's story. This is an entire network. The records in our possession reveal multiple officers, even senior officials, complicit. They used power to crush the voices of the vulnerable. I signaled to Grace. She stepped forward, placing a wooden box on the podium. Inside were USB drives, recordings, photographs. She looked straight into the cameras, her voice cold as steel. This is the evidence I've kept for 6 years. They thought I disappeared. But I survived, and I came back to prove they cannot escape. The crowd erupted, shouts, questions, the roar of chaos. Who's involved? Do you have evidence against state officials? Are you afraid of retaliation? I raised my hand for silence, then spoke slowly. Everything will be turned over to internal affairs and federal authorities. But today the public has the right to know this truth exists. The air exploded. Live broadcasts flashed banners. Governor's wife exposes police corruption network. Grace, standing beside me, her piercing eyes, became the front page image that afternoon. Later that day, Rachel from Internal Affairs called, her voice urgent. Melanie, we just got word. Ethan escaped custody. I gripped the phone, my voice sharp. What do you mean? He used a fake ID to bypass a checkpoint. He's heading for Cincinnati Airport. But federal agents have been alerted. He won't get far. I stood frozen, heart pounding. Ethan, the brother who once held my hand as a child, was now fleeing like a cowardly criminal. That night, the news blared everywhere. Officer Ethan Carter arrested at International Airport attempting to flee the U.S. with a forged passport. His image in handcuffs, face stunned, filled national television. I sat watching, not a tear shed. Daniel placed his hand on my shoulder, his voice low. He chose this path. You can't carry it for him. I nodded, eyes fixed on the screen. Because I knew Ethan's arrest was only the beginning. The names in those files, the officials who worked with him, were what would truly shake the system. The next day, headlines broke. Multiple subpoenas issued from mid-level officers to city officials. The public was stunned. Crowds gathered outside police headquarters, holding signs demanding justice for forgotten victims. Grace and I sat in a small room behind City Hall, peering out the window at the sea of people. She tilted her head and murmured, "This is only the start, Melanie. They'll push back. They'll try to silence us." I answered firmly, "Then we push harder. The truth doesn't belong to us anymore. It belongs to everyone out there." Outside, the chants grew louder, pounding like drums. And I knew the road ahead would not be easy. But this time I wasn't walking alone. I had Grace, the people, and justice itself rising to stand with me. Courtroom number 3 of the federal courthouse in Louisville was packed. Harsh white lights glared from the ceiling, reflecting off tense faces. I sat in the witness chair, hands folded neatly on my lap, my heart pounding but my eyes steady. Across from me, Ethan sat in a pale gray suit trying to appear calm, but his clenched fists had turned his knuckles white. The judge struck the gavel, voice echoing, "Call the witness, Melanie Carter." I walked slowly, my heels tapping against the tile, each step echoing in Ethan's ears. He glanced at me with a forced half-smile, the same look he wore as a child when he tried to hide his mistakes. But that smile carried no weight now. Standing tall at the microphone, I raised my hand and swore the oath. The prosecutor began with the familiar question. "Mrs. Carter, please state your relationship to the defendant, Ethan Carter." I looked directly at the jury, my voice clear. "He is my brother." A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. I recounted every detail of the day Ethan arrested me in that cafe, the look in his eyes as he snapped the cuffs, the mocking tone he used. My words were paired with video footage taken by a customer through the cafe window. On the large screen, Ethan leaned in, sneering, "One phone call won't save you." The courtroom erupted in shock. The prosecutor moved on to the next piece of evidence. Text messages pulled from an internal group chat between Ethan and other officers. One of his messages flashed on the screen. "She thinks teaching high school makes her special. Pathetic." Another read, "Let her talk about justice. Nobody believes a washed-up, lonely woman." Gasps filled the room and some jurors shook their heads. Then Grace Fontaine was called to the stand. She showed no fear. Her voice was calm, but every word cut like a blade. She told of the night at 19 when Ethan threatened her, how her case was closed in 48 hours, and how she spent years secretly gathering proof. When she produced a USB drive containing recordings of Ethan bragging that he had shut a victim up forever, outrage swept the courtroom. Ethan's lawyer scrambled, claiming Grace was biased and rewriting history. But the prosecutor immediately played another recording, Ethan at a drunken gathering boasting, "That Fontaine girl thought she could get away. I taught her a lesson." There was no denying it. Ethan's head dropped, sweat beading on his forehead. When it was my turn for cross-examination, his lawyer smirked. "Mrs. Carter, you left your position as a federal prosecutor long ago. Isn't this just an attempt to revive your name to gain attention?" I answered firmly without pause, "I don't need fame. I need justice. And if justice begins with exposing my own brother's crimes, I will not back down." The room went silent. I turned to Ethan. He no longer looked arrogant. His shoulders slumped, his eyes red, as though he realized for the first time that the wall of lies around him had finally crumbled. After 3 days of testimony, the judge delivered the verdict. Ethan Carter was convicted of abuse of power, unlawful detention, obstruction of justice, and sexual assault. The sentence: 32 years in prison with no parole for the first 15. As the sentence was read, the room stirred. Some of his victims sobbed openly, clinging to each other. Grace stood still, her eyes sharp but her lips trembling as if a wound had finally begun to close. Ethan was led out in handcuffs, his face pale. He looked back at me once, his lips moving soundlessly. I didn't want to hear. For me, the confrontation ended the moment the gavel struck. I walked out of the courtroom, afternoon light pouring through the long corridor. The heavy wooden doors closed behind me, shutting out the dark past. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. Not because of victory, but because the truth had finally been spoken aloud before the entire world. After the trial, many asked if I planned to return to law. They said someone who had once been a federal prosecutor would be welcomed back, that I could pick up my unfinished career. but I refused. I knew returning would only pull me back into the same whirlpool of power and politics I had once escaped. What I wanted wasn't a title. It was a refuge for people like Grace who once knocked on my door in despair and were left behind. Months later, the Safe Haven Fund was born. I chose the name because it evoked a home, a harbor for those who had no one left to trust. We rented a small office in an old red brick building on Jefferson Street. The walls were worn, but wide windows flooded the room with light. On the glass door, fresh lettering gleamed: legal support and housing for victims of power abuse. Grace agreed to join as a partner. On the first day we signed the founding papers, she sat in silence for a long time. I teased lightly, "Do you doubt I'll see this through?" Grace met my eyes, her voice low but steady. "I believe you're doing the right thing. But I'm not ready to trust anyone completely." I nodded. I understood. Wounds like hers don't heal after one verdict. She came to the office regularly, spending hours combing through files, calling those who had once filed complaints and then vanished into forced silence. But outside of work, she kept her distance. She always left before we closed, rarely stayed for meals. I didn't fault her. Her presence itself was proof of survival. Letters soon poured in. A middle-aged woman wrote that she had been threatened by police when reporting her abusive husband. A 20-year-old young man shared how he was coerced into a confession simply because he couldn't afford a lawyer. The stories differed, but all carried the same truth. They had been abandoned by the very system meant to protect them. Each letter strengthened my resolve. I hired young, passionate lawyers, brought in trauma counselors, and launched a 24/7 hotline. We didn't promise to win every case, but we vowed no one would ever fight alone again. One winter afternoon, just before closing, the doorbell chimed. A thin 17-year-old girl stood there, clutching a worn backpack. Her wide, dark eyes glistened with fear, her lips trembling. Is this the place for people who don't know who to trust?" Her voice was so soft I had to step closer to hear. I looked into her eyes I recognized, Grace's eyes years ago, my own eyes that day in the cafe with handcuffs biting my wrists. I smiled gently, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now." In that moment, the meaning of everything became clear. Justice wasn't only in a courtroom with a gavel's strike. Justice was when someone vulnerable could walk into a room and know they would not be abandoned. Grace stood quietly in the back, watching. As the girl sat down, I caught a glimpse of Grace's gaze softening, the steel in her eyes dimmed for once. Perhaps she too began to believe that her scarred survival had helped build this refuge. I closed my notebook and took a deep breath. Outside, snow dusted Jefferson Street in white. I knew challenges lay ahead and forces would try to stop us. But this time I wasn't alone. I had Grace, I had voices willing to rise, and I had the certainty that truth, once lit, could never be extinguished. Melanie's story shows that justice isn't confined to a courtroom. It lives in the courage to stand up, break the silence, and protect those who've been abandoned. In real life, many still face abuse of power and the fear of being forgotten. But if someone listens and offers the words, "You're safe now," the darkness begins to fade. The greatest lesson is this: truth may be buried, but once revealed, it frees both the victim and the witness. What do you think about Melanie's journey and her courageous choices? If it were you, how would you act? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to follow the channel for more powerful family stories.